In some ways, And Coachie Makes Three is a really difficult Cheers episode to watch because it's really emotional and a little bit uncomfortable at times, but it's also very funny. There are a lot of specific moments that I just laughed out loud at. In a moment, I'll give a spoiler warning and discuss some of those specifics, but to begin with, this will be spoiler free. And Coachie Makes Three is the 15th episode of the second season of Cheers, directed by the wonderful James Burrows. And this focuses on the fact that Coach keeps spending a lot of time with Sam and Diane, and while they love the coach, they obviously want some alone time, and they don't really know how to approach this because they don't want to just tell Coach to go away, but they need some time alone, and it's an emotional roller coaster. And I will go into some specifics about that in a moment. But I think what's really interesting about this episode is that, well, actually, there are two things. First of all, the opening actually extends past the credits, which I thought was interesting. Normally we have the opening and then the opening credits and then a new scene, but this one extends a little bit, which I thought was quite fascinating. And then the first proper scene, as the narrative kicks in, is actually in Diane's apartment, and we do start to spend more and more time away from Cheers. And personally, I think that's a great look at the characters. It allows for more storylines, but I did miss the bar in this episode. I did miss it quite a bit, so I'm glad that we do keep coming back to this central location because it's just such a wonderful environment where anything can happen and anybody can walk in and you never know who you're going to meet or what's going to happen. We do spend a lot of time away from Cheers here, but it works well for the narrative. So I'll go into some spoiler thoughts now. I will talk about what happens with Coach, and I'll also share some, particular highlights and moments that I found quite funny. So initially, they decide to try and tell the coach, the coach to leave, and okay, I don't even think it's that funny, but I just had to pause this recording and laugh for about 2 minutes because it's okay. It entertains me a lot. I'm going to get past this and move on. When they first chuck the coach out and they open the door again and he's just standing there and it turns out his coat was stuck in the door, but he didn't have the heart to knock again. Honestly, it was so adorable and so funny. It's probably not as funny as I'm making it seem, but it was just so unexpected. And just the thought of the coach just standing there all night, it was rather sweet. But obviously they feel terrible about this, so they try and set Coach up with Katherine, played by Eve Roberts, who is somebody from the bank who he happened to mention recently to Carla that he found quite attractive. And they kind of only touch upon her involvement in this. She's only really in one scene, but it was quite nice to see Coach having this potential romantic interest, and Coach has some brilliant lines about spaghetti for four and just his witty comebacks. Well, they're not even witty comebacks. They're written as witty comebacks, but it's just Coach's personality when he just says these things in response to her, and it's just funny comeback after funny comeback, and it's just Coach's personality. Just every time he said something to her, it just became increasingly entertaining. And I don't know why I found spaghetti for four so funny, but I really did. And it was just beautifully written, and obviously Nicholas Colasanto's delivery of those lines was just flawless. That all went really well. But when they finally had to tell him straight, we don't want you around, and he just kind of left, it was heartbreaking. And I think the really good thing about this is that they didn't drag it out. I'd say the whole scene from him coming back into the apartment to then leaving again, it mustn't have been more than 2 minutes. Obviously, it's a sitcom, it's meant to be quite funny, but obviously with some more serious undertones. And I think had it lasted any longer, it would have been too uncomfortable. I think they got the timing of it spot on. Ultimately, what happened with that narrative the following morning, I think was the right direction. Everything worked really well. One of my highlights of the full episode is when Norma's waiting on the steps for Sam and Diane to return, or to open the bar, and they enter, and Norm just waits at the door, and he's just waiting until somebody realises he can't enter the bar without his entrance, and I absolutely adored it. Norm was really brilliant in this one, actually. It starts off with Norm sitting on the wrong side of the bar. He's sitting with Cliff on the opposite side, and it's so peculiar, and it just felt really awkward. Norm spitting out his drink after what Cliff said to Carla, just everything in this episode I thought was fabulous. The scene where Coach is trying to remember the name of the person in the the bank, and just one by one they all have to go out after Sam, after Diane, after Carla. It amused me so much. Needless to say, Nicholas Colasanto is the star of this episode. Pretty much all of the comedy came from him. A lot came from Norm as well, George Wendt, but for me, most of the comedy, understandably, came from the Coach, and I just think it's a beautiful, beautiful episode. Obviously, it's more emotional watching it now. I've seen this episode before, of course, but watching it now, knowing what happens with the Coach, with Nicholas Colasanto, it's even more emotional, and it just makes me wonder what things could have been like and what kind of stories we could have had over the seasons that followed. But we are lucky to have this episode, and it's so funny, and I have tears in my eyes because it's an emotional episode, but it's a very, very funny episode. Really thoroughly enjoyed it. I won't go on about it any longer, but needless to say, And Coachie Makes Three, despite being quite emotional, is easily one of the funniest and one of the best episodes of Cheers.